So here is a really big map of the steroid hormone family. And it could look like I'm putting this here just to terrify you, but I'm not. I just want you to see how interlinked all of these steroid hormones are. So we're going to start here with cholesterol, and all of these different steroid hormones are going to be synthesized off of it. And you can synthesize into progesterones, into pregnenolones, testosterone, and DHT, so androgens. You can go into estrogens, cortisol, and aldosterone. So one of the main things to think about here is these are all going to be structurally fairly similar. And if they're structurally similar, then they're more likely to be able to cross-bind to each other's receptors. So some progesterones are close enough in structure to testosterones that they can bind to testosterone receptors. The other factor to point out is that since the synthetic pathways are all connected, then if you put in a drug to block one step here of synthesis of one particular hormone, you might be messing up synthesis of another one. Say if I wanted to come in and block synthesis of progesterones, I might be blocking synthesis of aldosterones at the same time. So you have to look very carefully about how blocking one system can interact with another in terms of drug side effects. This is basically just the same type of idea, really just here to show you that cholesterol is that main base structure, and that you can go to progesterones, pregnenolone, aldosterone, cortisol, and the sex hormones directly from cholesterol. So of all the hormones, steroid hormones have a really specific role to play in the body. And again, remember, steroid hormones come off of that cholesterol backbone, but steroid hormones do not bind to ligand-gated ion channels, and they don't bind to G-protein coupled receptors like we talked about in cardiac, pulmonary, and neuro. What these guys are going to do is act on interior cytoplasmic receptors, and they're going to change the transcription of genes in a cell, and therefore changes the cell function, because a cell is and does what the genes that it's producing tell it to do. So steroid hormones, and remember these are lipophilic, are going to be in the system, circulatory system. They're going to come on, and instead of binding to a receptor on the outside of the cell, they have to enter the cell itself. At that point, in the cytoplasm, there are steroid receptors. And again, only the cells that want to respond to that steroid will have the receptor. So you won't have estrogen receptors in every different cell in every cell of your body, only the cells that should be responding to it. So the steroid hormones entered the cell, the steroid binds to the cytosolic receptor. They call it a nuclear receptor, and you'll see why, but it's in the cytosol to begin with. Then once that complex is made, it's actually moved into the nucleus and then binds to DNA at specific points. And that's why it's called that nuclear receptor, because it's going in there. At that point, what it's doing is by binding to these specific gene start-stop points, you're controlling which genes are going to then be expressed. So it can increase expression of some genes and decrease expression of others. As a result, that can change the function of a cell, so it tells the cell how to act. And secondary, which is really important when we talk about sex hormones, they can act as growth promoters. And so what we'll see about sex hormones is that they can activate the process for cell replication, for mitosis, and in so doing so, increase those cell types. So those are growth promoters and functional modulators. So what we want to do, we're going to go through each of these pathways, and what I want you to think about for each pathway are these main ideas. What is the overarching role? So if we're talking about growth hormone or thyroid hormone, what is that hormone really doing in the body? What's the main thing? You're going to learn the hormones A, B, and C. You want to know your primary and secondary target tissues. You want to know what the physiological consequence is, what's happening at the end result, ovulation or glucose production. And then if we talk about them, you want to know what stimulatory factors might occur. And by that I mean what is going to activate that whole pathway to begin with. So that's really what you need to know in terms of understanding each of these pathways. If you understand that, then you're going to understand any kind of drug that I tell you that acts in that pathway. So you wouldn't then have to memorize what's happening with those drugs. There aren't many drugs I'm going to actually ask you to know specifically. What I'm probably going to do is ask you things like, what would a blocker of hormone A do? Or what would happen if you increased activity at hormone B receptors? So anything that asks you to understand how a drug that mimics a hormone or blocks its release or blocks receptor activity, how would that affect the downstream activities? Would it increase the activity of the target tissues? Would it decrease their activity? And then we're covering a couple of different diseases, growth hormone and cortisol disorders. So understanding those specific causes and symptoms of those disorders is important. Like I said, I'm not giving you any drug names for this one. This is really a very conceptual. So I drew this out to help you kind of see it the way I see it, which is kind of scary. But when talked about, we are starting with the hypothalamus. Hormone A is released onto the pituitary, which releases hormone B, which goes on to the primary tissue, which releases hormone C, which goes on to the secondary tissue, which has its physiological effect. So that's what I'm drawing here right now. So while there's multiple different pathways here, they're all really doing that same thing. You have the hypothalamic release that activates the pituitary to release the second, which activates that primary tissue to release hormone C, which then has its effect on the final tissue. And you can use this little chart in order to see at each step which ones are activating what next tissue and what the effect of that is going to be. So we're going to start by talking about the cortisol pathway. And so the cortisol pathway is going to start in the hypothalamus with corticotropin releasing hormone, then hits the pituitary, which releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, then hits the adrenal cortex, which releases cortisol, which then goes to almost every cell in the body. When we look at this as a diagram, we can follow that pathway, hypothalamus, releasing to the anterior pituitary, releasing down to the adrenal glands or adrenal cortex, which then releases cortisol into the system and acts on immune cells, liver cells, muscle cells, and adipose tissue. There's going to be other cells and tissues that it affects as well, but those are the main ones that we're going to be looking at. So what is the point of cortisol? Cortisol really is the stress hormone. So what you're looking at here is basically you're looking at the mountain lion. I'm hiking. I used to live in Colorado. We hiked all the time. We had to have whistles and we had to be on the lookout for those mountain lions. So I never saw any, but regardless, I had a whistle. So I felt cool. So you see that mountain lion, and now you need to get your system ready to run and to take care of yourself. So you're optimizing your body for a danger response. On the other hand, it's also reducing your immune response. And when you think about immune, that may not make sense to begin with, but remember, inflammation and the immune system are the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin. So anything you do that's going to reduce inflammation is also going to reduce your immunity. So these are glucocorticoids, and they again are steroid hormones, and they have to have stimulation. And by that I mean you're not constantly going to be releasing the same amount of cortisol all day, every day for the rest of your life. You're going to have circadian rhythms in terms of cortisol release. But one of the main things that we see with cortisol release right now is stress. And so it can be released under acute stress. It can also be released under chronic stress. Acute stress is fine. That's your mountain lion. You want to release it under acute stress. Under acute stress, you're going to activate ATP energy sources. So that's where our gluconeogenesis, our protein catabolism, and our lipolysis come in. We're just burning stuff up, we're getting ATP. That way we can run from the mountain lion. Acutely, we're also increasing blood pressure by vasoconstricting. That's great, want to do that. And we're having that anti-inflammatory / immunosuppressive effect. All that's great to begin with. Once you get away from the mountain lion and you get home, that's a whole different matter. Having that acute stress is fine. Long-term chronic stress, like, let me guess, has multiple negative health effects. And so your body is not wanting to go through this chronic cortisol level. So really that's the take home about cortisol. We have some diseases that are specifically associated with cortisol. We have high cortisol levels and low cortisol. We call this high cortisol level syndrome Cushing's syndrome. And usually that's because there's a pituitary tumor. So remember the pituitary tumor causing increased release, or because you're on a steroidal drug that has that cross reactivity with the cortisol pathway. And so you can have it from either reason. We're not going to go into the disorder itself because you're going to be talking about those when you talk about clinical treatment. But I do want you to recognize that those high cortisol levels do create Cushing's syndrome, and low cortisol levels create Addison's disease. Addison's disease is often because the body is immune attacking the adrenal gland. And so if you're attacking the adrenal gland, it can't produce cortisol. And again, you'll be looking at the diagnostics of Addison's and Cushing's later in the curriculum. So I'm going to present you some practice questions here, and you can go work on those, and I'll post a key to these with your lectures. So the next set of hormones we're going to talk about are the sex hormones. Then we have estrogen, progesterone, and the androgens. Androgens include testosterone and dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And when we talk about male sex hormones in another lecture, we'll go into the difference between those. So we call this the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, or HPG. And we're going to start with gonadotropin releasing hormone being released from the hypothalamus. That goes to the pituitary, which releases one of two different hormones. So it can release luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone. Everybody releases both, but they each have a different function. Those are going to be released into the body to the primary tissue, which in this case is either the ovaries or the testes. And the ovaries or testes release the hormone C, which is going to be either progestin, estrogen, or testosterone. That's hormone C. That then goes into the system to the final or secondary tissues, which include the breast and the sex hormones. Of course, other tissues are also affected by sex hormones. So when we look at this axis, what I want to do is let you know that I'll be talking about the sex hormones in another lecture, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. So I might be leaving some things out that are on the slides as we're going, but so don't worry about that at this point. Here when we talk about the androgens, we're talking about the male sex hormones is basically what we're considering them. And what these guys are doing is they're producing developmental anatomy. So in fetal development, those will be giving us male structures and connectivity within the brain as well as the genitalia, and maintain male metabolic functions, which we're going to see are somewhat different than the general female metabolic levels and functions, as well as maintaining and developing male anatomy and neural and reproductive functions. So again, these are steroid hormones, and they have growth factor functions, are very important in what they do. So when you think about the sexual anatomical development in the womb and during puberty, those are growth factor functions of testosterone and androgens. The effects of these are going to be androgenic and anabolic. As we said, they're going to develop sex-specific anatomy and physiology, and they're going to develop spermatogenesis. So here when we look at the diagram, I don't want you guys during this lecture to be worried about inhibin or the difference between Leydig and Sertoli cells. What I want you guys to get from this lecture is that axis that we're talking about, where in the hypothalamus you release gonadotropin releasing hormone, That acts at the pituitary, where you release either luteinizing hormone or follicle stimulating hormone. Those, because we're talking about the male anatomy, are going to go and activate different cells in the testes. They're going to have different functions, one of which is to release hormone C, which is testosterone, which is going to have these downstream effects on muscle mass, body hair growth, bone lengthening, etc., that we're going to be talking about very specifically in the male sex hormone lecture. This also has to have that negative feedback, so the testosterone goes back up here and reduces release of GnRH. That's really the whole detail that you need to know for this. For the HPG axis for the female sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, those are going to produce sex-related female developmental anatomy. They're going to maintain female metabolic, anatomic, neural, and reproductive functions, just as we saw with the male sex hormones. So again, steroidal hormone, very closely related to testosterone, and growth factor functions. We'll talk about the estrogenic and progesterogenic effects when we talk about female sex hormones specifically, and we talk about menopause and contraception. But the actions that are kind of more obvious are the development, fetal development, and puberty development of sex-specific anatomy and physiology, and the maintenance of those, as well as then in women, also ovulation and pregnancy maintenance. So here when we look at that pathway, it actually looks a little simpler than the male pathway. It isn't really, it just looks that way. So we had the hypothalamus, GnRH being released, caused the pituitary to release either LH or FSH. That went to the ovaries. The ovaries are that primary tissue right there. Those are releasing either estrogen or progesterone. And that estrogen or progesterone is going to that secondary tissue, or that's target tissues, including the uterus, the breast tissue, the neurons, etc., etc. That estrogen or progesterone comes back up here and is a negative feedback inhibition. So the more estrogen or progestin you have, the more negative feedback you have, and you can shut down GnRH release, LH release, or FSH release. That becomes very important because that's really the main mechanism of hormonal contraception, is to use estrogen and progestin products in order to shut down this whole pathway. If you shut it down, then you block ovulation. If you want to know more about that, come to my sex hormone contraception lecture.